Hi students, here we are the last week of school, week 32, 33, whatever it is right here. There's a ton to cover today, and I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to be able to finish through here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get where I hope I can get to, and then I'm going to have one short, small other lecture for you to watch whenever you can, okay? It's going to be basically about the 9/11 attacks and George W. Bush, and it'll be short. But this one will be a little long today because, I'm still recovering from that week that we lost there. I'll send you an email about your project. There is something on the last page of your assignment explaining your project. Essentially, you're going to make a PowerPoint, and then we're going to have a Zoom meeting next week and get together and you'll present your PowerPoint. It won't take us very long. There's only 4 of you, and so we will get through it. So let's get going right here. I'm going to whiz through this, and we're not going to be able to watch really any videos. Okay, here we go. So we ended in 1964 after the death of John F. Kennedy, and then Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson on the right here, is going to run against a very conservative man from Arizona named Barry Goldwater. LBJ was so good at smearing him with commercials that it turned him into, people thought he was a monster. He was really a great guy, but one of the commercials was showing a little girl picking flowers, and then she exploded and blew up because of a nuclear bomb. And therefore, that Goldwater was all about bringing about nuclear warfare. Well, that was not true. But he won pretty big. Here we can see Goldwater. Notice that the Republican is in the South now. Remember, there's a little change coming along now where the South is going to be sort of moving toward Republican. LBJ was from Texas, which explains why Texas went with LBJ. But look at the rest of the country. He was very liberal, and the South is more conservative. And even after all that smearing of Goldwater, they still went with him. And Arizona was where Goldwater was from. That's why he won that. All right, so LBJ is going to continue on as president. In 1964, he passed the Voting Rights Act, which was a law that guaranteed, I'm doing hand quotes here, the rights of blacks to vote, especially in the South where there were poll taxes and other ways to keep them from voting. And LBJ was very upset when this didn't fix all of the racial problems in our country. He thought that a law would fix that. But truthfully, the only thing that's going to fix hate is going to be the love of Christ in a heart, right? That's the only thing that'll work. He did appoint the first African American to the American Supreme Court. His name is Thurgood Marshall. He was one of the guys who had defended Linda Brown in Brown versus the Board of Education. This is him young, probably when he was doing that defense, Brown versus Board. This is him later, right? So he stayed on the court a long time. He became a very old man there. But he was appointed in 1965. There was a big march at this time in Selma, Alabama, where the African-American coalition wanted to demand their equal rights. And they were going to march from Selma to Montgomery, and they got stopped along the way. So here's Martin Luther King Jr. in a part of the march. He was in one part of the march, and then the march that got stopped by the police, that area that was called Bloody Sunday. Martin Luther King had left at that point in time. They thought he was a little bit of a lightning rod, and they took him out, and other people were marching at that time. But he was, of course, carrying on his idea of peaceful protest and to nonviolent protest, right? He wanted to achieve their goals by just making people aware of the inequities out there. He didn't want any violence at all. He got thrown into jail a couple of times because of that, but he went willingly, okay? So LBJ started his agenda, which he called the Great Society. There are a few things here. He started the war on poverty. He spent a lot of money on education. This is probably the biggest one that's still with us now, is that he developed Medicare and Medicaid, which was health care for older people and people who were completely indigent, meaning no income at all. Typically people who are chronically ill, that kind of thing. He passed measures for the environment. He devoted money to art. The Job Corps was similar to the Peace Corps, but in America, right? The Job Corps. Head Start was a program for education, so a lot of emphasis on education right here. He really felt like legislation was the way to get things done, and a lot of his stuff came up empty because legislation typically doesn't change hearts, and he was always sad about that. But we still have Medicare to this day. All right, we have foreign policy problems. Vietnam was still a problem. He inherited this problem from John F. Kennedy, and sadly it got worse at this point in time. His head general was a guy named William Westmoreland, and then the person running the show was his Secretary of War. His name is Robert McNamara. And these guys, Robert McNamara is a politician type, he's a number cruncher, if you will, and he's trying to run the war like a chess game or something. Whereas Westmoreland knows that people are dying out there and he needs to run that war from the ground level. They're trying to run this war from Washington, D.C. It turned out to be an utter failure. Here are our guys over there. Vietnam is a tropical jungle. It's very wet, hot, steamy, bugs, tropical diseases, not to mention that the enemy they're fighting. So in South Vietnam, they had the South Vietnamese army fighting with Americans against the North Vietnamese army and a group called the Viet Cong. Now, the Viet Cong were South Vietnamese who believed in communism. So they were fighting for the North, but they were South Vietnamese. It was very difficult for our guys to figure out who was a good guy, who was a bad guy. And there were booby traps everywhere. So this is a pit that, of course, would have been covered by something, and those are very sharpened bamboo sticks down there. So if one of our guys were walking along and fell into that, it would, impale his leg and render him, injured for some period of time. If he fell on his something besides his legs, if he fell in forward or something, he could be killed in something like this. Here's another type one. They're walking through the water like we saw that picture. You can see a tripwire right here that's gonna cause an explosion right there and blow our guys' legs off. Just horrible, horrible stuff. Not to mention chemicals that are being dropped in the from airplanes. One called Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a exfoliant or a defoliated the leaves on the trees. It killed the trees, because you couldn't see where anybody was because of all the jungle, and so they just basically killed the jungle. But the poison was also poisonous to our guys, to their people. Cancer developed. This picture shows our guys going from town to town trying to figure out who the bad guys are. And they couldn't figure out who they were, so they're literally going door to door and saying, are you a good guy, are you a bad guy? And sometimes somebody would come out with a vest that they exploded. All right, so we had some things like that. Very bad. Tet is a holiday in Vietnam, and there was a ceasefire called on the Tet, which is about January, into February. And so what happened was that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong actually attacked on that holiday when they had called a ceasefire. So, I guess everything's fair in war. And our guys weren't ready for it. And so they came into Saigon and they started to plunder the place. Our guys were completely caught on their back feet. It was a huge embarrassment, but then our guys rallied and were able to win. So the Tet Offensive, while it was effective for the Northern Vietnamese, it was ultimately won by the Americans, but it was very bad press at home. All right, the media was embedded with our army, and they were showing pictures all the way back home, doing interviews, and hearing right from the source the bad stuff that was going on. They showed bombs, they showed injured guys, and it very much turned the tide against the war from the people back home. We lost the stomach for it. We couldn't stand it. We were thinking, where is this place? Why are we helping these people? And so it became very unpopular. Furthermore, the draft was reinstituted, and it was called the draft lottery. If your number was picked, you win, right? And you have to go off to war. So that there were people that were 19 and 20 years old that were eligible for the draft. These guys decided to rebel against it. They said, resist. Don't register, burn your draft card, and some of them even left the country and went to Canada. They were called draft dodgers. And lots of protests on university campuses, lots of young people, but also women, so mothers. Mothers came out against the war and said, I don't want my son to go. Some who had sons that were there said, I want my son to come home, this kind of thing. It also helped to form what is known as the hippie culture. These people who maybe had dodged the draft, who had burned their draft card, they just went off the grid. That's what we'd call it today, going off the grid. And they started, living in buses together, and they had these little communes and things like this. One of the central locations for that was in San Francisco at a particular neighborhood where there's two streets called Haight and Ashbury. And so you might hear songs or something talking about Haight-Ashbury. Haight-Ashbury is a region of San Francisco where a bunch of these hippies hung out, sort of, dropping out and not really moving or anything. But we also had the Jesus movement, which I would probably say also started in California, maybe even San Francisco. These guys were called Jesus freaks. So they're pulling away from the regular society, but they are going toward Jesus. It was true stuff. Here they are, Jesus one way, his way. The new Bible came out called The Way. And for the most part, I think it was a little mini revival among young people. Try Jesus. We had some popular songs out there. The Doobie Brothers, Jesus is Just All Right With Me. I don't know that they were Christians, but the guy on the right, his name is Keith Green, and he was part of the hippie culture and wrote some really great Christian songs, kind of the very beginning of what we call contemporary Christian music, which we still have today, right? And so Keith Green, you might know some of his songs if your church does any kind of some of the, the popular songs versus just hymns. You might have heard some of his songs. He tragically was killed in a plane crash. He was up, going for a ride with a friend in the plane crash, which is sad. This is John McCain. Now, John McCain was a soldier fighting in Vietnam. You may have heard his name before. Well, he was a fighter pilot. He was the son of the most senior naval officer in the war at the time, John McCain Sr., I think. And his grandfather had been a famous Army guy, too. Well, while he was flying over in Vietnam, he was actually, I don't have that picture, he was shot down and recovered over the water. He was injured in the crash of the plane. I think he may have, ejected out. But he was captured by the North Vietnamese and taken to a POW camp, so a prisoner of war camp, known as the Hanoi Hilton, and he was kept there. Now, when they found out that his father was a famous naval officer, they offered to give him a release as long as he told them that he was treated really well. Well, he hadn't been treated really well, and furthermore, he was unwilling to leave behind the other men in the Hanoi Hilton, in the POW camp, just because he had the advantage of having a famous father. He ended up staying the entire time and wasn't released until America left the war. This brings us to 1968. This was a big year in American history. First of all, LBJ had become increasingly unpopular because of the war. So those war protests and things going on took their toll on LBJ. He had been trying to run that war himself from Washington. He was doing a poor job of it. More and more guys. I think 1968 actually marked the highest number of deaths of our soldiers in Vietnam. And so there was going to be an election in 1968, and he said, "I shall not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." He would have been eligible for another term because that first one he served for just a year was part of Kennedy's term. So now we have a couple of other candidates stepping up. This is Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's younger brother, and this was the former, vice president. Remember him? That's Richard Nixon. So remember, it's 1968. He had lost to John F. Kennedy. He had not run against LBJ, but now he saw his time again. But he's going to be running against another Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who is also a very popular guy. And then we had the vice president of the United States was running as well. His name is Hubert Humphrey. So he was going to be the natural successor to LBJ. And then we even had another candidate, a Dixiecrat. This would have been a Southern Democrat. His name is George Wallace. He was the governor of Alabama. Alabama was probably the center of the racial, trouble in America. And furthermore, the trouble that they had on the bridge on Bloody Sunday was brought down by George Wallace. He had told the police to sick the dogs on the protesters and to open up fire hoses on these guys. And so George Wallace was, probably most accounts I would say, a racist guy. 1968 still, right? Here's Martin Luther King right here. He is in Memphis, I believe I'm right about that, and going to make a speech. Here he is coming out early from the Lorraine Motel, coming out to greet a crowd that's down there, and a few seconds later a shot rang out and he had been assassinated. So somebody was, I don't know, they're pointing over this way. There was a shooter, a racist KKK guy, had a rifle, and he shot and killed Martin Luther King Jr. on that day in Memphis. Very sad. Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was on the campaign trail. He heard about the assassination, and he was the one that had to give the announcement to the people, the very sad announcement that Martin Luther King Jr. had died. And it was a blow to everybody. And he, as a candidate, said, I am here to work hard to put an end to this racial problem in our country. He went to California to campaign. I believe he won the California primary. So we have those three different candidates running for the for the Democrat nomination, and this guy won the primary in California, which would have been a big prize. So here he is at the Ambassador Hotel in LA giving his acceptance speech for having won that, very happy that night. And as he was leaving, they decided instead of taking him through the big crowd that was all raucous, they would take him the back route out the back door through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. Little did they know that there was an assassin waiting there, a guy that was crazed. We don't know much about him. His name was Sirhan, and he came right up to him and shot him point blank, and Robert Kennedy did not survive the night. So he was killed. So this is all happening in 1968. Chicago was where the Democrats were having their convention for the nomination of the president. Now that their front runner was dead, and they basically have the two, Hubert Humphrey versus Wallace, who really had no chance right there. And so you can see this is Hubert Humphrey. He's going to accept the nomination, but there was trouble in there. All these people having this big party, if you will, for the nomination, but some guys pulled out signs in the midst of it saying stop the war. See, some of them had them on newspapers so they wouldn't be confiscated before they came in. So these are regular, not candidates, but delegates to the convention who are asking to stop the war. So kind of a little bit that way. But outside it was even worse. There was a riot outside for people who were not delegates, and the police had to come in and arrested a lot of people that night in Chicago. So the election finally happens. It is Nixon versus Humphrey. Wallace stayed in. He did not get the Democrat nomination, but he ran as what I said is called a Dixiecrat. Notice he did get quite a few votes. So who do you think he took votes away from? Probably away from Humphrey, right? Probably away from the Democrat, leaving a very thin win, 43.2 versus 42.6 for Richard Nixon. The way it shakes out in Electoral College is a little more obvious for Nixon right there. So you can see our red and blue. And Nixon will become then president number, I don't have it on there, president number something. Anyway, here he is taking the oath of office. There's Humphrey right there, because remember, he was a sitting vice president at the time. So the Vietnam War was chief on his mind. During the campaign, he had intimated that he wanted to get our boys out of the war. He didn't want to continue on with Lyndon Johnson's way of doing the war. And so this was his Secretary of State. His name is Henry Kissinger. He's a foreign man, a German guy, heavy accent and everything. And the Vietnamization was the idea of a gradual withdrawal of troops and being able to achieve some sort of peace through an alliance or an agreement. Okay, they realized that we weren't going to win the war outright by battle, but if they could come out with something similar to what had happened in Korea. And so that was the idea right here. The problem is that Nixon didn't bring this around quickly enough. So we still had guys being drafted, going off to war, dying in the war. And it looked like he wasn't doing anything different than LBJ had done. But he decided to branch out on his foreign policy. He made an unprecedented visit to China. This is communist China right here, trying to make friends with them because they have just had a break. They just had a break with Russia, with the USSR. And so he said, well, if we can make friends with China, then we can foster that relationship and still keep the Cold War going on with Russia. And so this was an interesting bet because the Chinese were actually backing the North Vietnamese in that war. So this was unusual for him to do this. All right, some of the good things that went on in Nixon's administration was the Apollo program. Remember that JFK had talked about getting a man on the moon in the decade of the 1960s. So here we are in 1969, and we're just getting to that place. So we're going to go back in time just a little bit, just in the 60s right here. The Apollo group. So remember, we had the Mercury program that had one astronaut that went up. Then we had the Gemini program that had 2 astronauts. Now we have the Apollo program, which has 3 astronauts going up. And in order to get to the moon, so this is the ultimate one to get up to the moon, they needed to have a very large rocket, which you kind of saw right here. It's this one. It's going to be the Saturn V that was developed by Wernher von Braun. And the little top right here is the spacecraft, or the command module right there. And there's a little model of the command module right here. Okay, so picture this. These three guys are going to fit in there on the real one, right? And that's going to be at the top of here. Now, they went to do a test. Mind you, they're in the rocket on the launch pad. They are not being launched. They're not going up into space. They are just doing some tests on the command module. Well, inside the command module, way at the top of that Saturn V rocket, there was a very a rich oxygen environment in there. And these three guys, we have Ed White. He was the guy that was the first to do the spacewalk. Remember him? We have Gus Grissom, and we have Roger Chaffee. And these three guys are up in the command module when something went wrong. There was a spark, and in the presence of that amount of oxygen, a fire. And those guys were trapped in that little module on the top of that giant rocket while there was a fire. They had no way of getting out. This is sadly the remnants of what happened in that module right there. So they were stuck up in there. They perished. They died. And of course, the Apollo program went back to step one, trying to figure out how to fix these problems. So this had been Apollo 1, and then they're going to have some other Apollo programs. I'll go back to it after fixing some things. But 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think, were all about fixing the problems inside here. So no manned type of trips at all. We finally get to Apollo 11. We had 2 or 3 go on up to the moon, go around it, take some pictures, come back. And it fell to Apollo 11 to actually land on the moon. So these are the guys that were the first moon warriors right here. We have Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and everybody forgets poor Michael Collins. He was the pilot. So while these two guys were down on the moon, he was up in the lunar command module going around the moon, waiting for them, and he was going to pick them up. Here's a picture that he took, that Michael Collins took, of the LEM, the lunar module, going down to the base of the moon right there. Pretty cool. They were going to land here at the Sea of Tranquility because they thought it was a very calm spot. They had taken lots of pictures prior to this. And when they got there, Neil Armstrong realized it was very rocky and not very flat, so he actually had to maneuver, almost like a little video game, maneuver the LEM over to the landing spot over here. And the guys in Houston were getting very nervous because as they were moving along, he was using fuel, and he needed a certain amount of fuel to get off of the moon. And they told him at one point, he said, I'm moving over, this many degrees to the north and to the south or to the east or whatever. And they said, you have 30 seconds. He did it. He landed it with enough time to have enough fuel to go back up. Famous picture here. I believe this is a picture of Buzz Aldrin taken by Neil Armstrong. You can see reflected in here the LEM, the lunar module, the lunar lander module. Okay, so they stayed up there for a little while, collected some moon rocks, and then they made it all the way back home. It was absolutely miraculous. And here, I remember this. I remember seeing this as a kid. I watched them. They actually had footage from the moon that we saw, and Neil Armstrong said the famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Mind you, when they first landed on this here, the first word was Houston. Houston, the Eagle has landed. Let's see, Houston Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed, is what he said. Okay, so then they came back down and using parachutes and stuff. See, here's that module, right? That triangular thing right there. They're in there. Notice how it looks all kind of roughed up. That's because they had to come back through the atmosphere. These naval guys called frogmen went out to rescue them. They were put into an isolation unit for a little while because nobody knew it was on the moon. It's possible there could have been some microbes or something that would have made them sick, some moon germs or something. So they kept them in there, I think, about 2 weeks until they found out there was nothing on the moon. We tested the dirt and the rocks that they brought back from it, and there was no life at all on the moon. Notice here they're talking to the president. That's Nixon right there. Apollo 13, they had a big problem. They went up, so 11, then 12, those guys landed on the moon. This was the next group to land on the moon. And so many people thought that it was bad luck to name it Apollo 13, even though it was the 13th mission, because 13's bad luck. Well, of course, scientists don't typically believe in bad luck. Well, this one turned out to be really bad luck. On the way out, they had a problem with the boosters, and they had to make a little adjustment there. But they fixed it, and they kept going. And then they noticed an explosion, and it turns out the oxygen tanks in the command module exploded. And that's what made their oxygen. And they needed that. So they had to all crawl into the lunar module so they could get oxygen, and they had to do some fancy maneuvering in order to get back into the command module to come back to the Earth. They did not land on the moon. They did not walk on the moon because it was important that they get back. This was touch and go, y'all. We had no idea if they were going to make it back. There's a great movie called Apollo 13 that shows all of the steps of this. It's a good one if you want to watch it. An election in 1972, Nixon ran again. I want you to take a look at that map, y'all. Guess where his opponent was from? The Democrat named McGovern. You think he was from Massachusetts? You're right. I don't even know who this Hosper's is. No idea. Libertarian right there. Look at the popular vote. 60% popular vote. That's crazy. 96.6 electoral. There's not even a word for this, y'all. Landslide didn't come close to it. As far as I know, that's the biggest victory ever in an election. So Nixon was pretty popular. You would think that he might have trouble because he had the problem with the counterculture, they called it. The counterculture of the people who are against the war and against the just the regular goings on of the government, okay? But that it also kicked in this idea of something known as the silent majority, the very conservative people. So Nixon was very popular in 1972, and then something bad happened. The World Trade Center was built during the Nixon administration. These are the two towers in New York City where all of the business of the world takes place. It was built, you can see here, with the two towers, Tower 1 and Tower 2, with these other buildings. So there were 7 buildings in all that were part of the World Trade Center complex. It had an interesting design. It was like a big bird cage on the outside here with open on the inside and all of the elevators on the middle. And you can see how because it's so tall, right? You don't want to be on this and have to go up, no, like that, right? So you go up to a landing and then catch another bank of elevators, go up to a landing and another bank of elevators. So it's pretty ingenious. This is the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. It turns out that the Democrat National Committee had their offices there during the 1972 election. And it turns out that some guys went in and spied on them. Okay, now this was not unusual for a party to try to spy on another party. It had been going on it's not right, but it had been going on for a long time. But these guys were so inept at it, they went into the Watergate Hotel earlier in the day and had put tape on the the door area so that the door wouldn't lock, so kind of a amateurish kind of thing like there. And then they broke back in. They were going to put some bugs in the telephones to kind of get an idea of what their opponent was going to do in the election. But you saw that map. They had nothing to worry about. Nixon won that so big. Why in the world was he so paranoid about winning? They did not learn anything from the Watergate, information that they got. But it turned into a scandal in the second term of Nixon. Nobody knew about it until the second term of Nixon, when some intrepid reporters got a tip and started reporting that Nixon himself had been part of the break-in. It turns out Nixon was not a part of the break-in. He had hired these guys and told them to go out there and work for the cause and get some good information. But he didn't tell them specifically to go into their headquarters and bug them. He never said that. But when it got found out, he did work on trying to cover it up and keep people from knowing the truth about it. So he became very unpopular. People thought he had cheated really badly there. And they kind of thought that he was not trustworthy. His name was Richard. People called him Tricky Dicky. So he had kind of a bad reputation at this point. So kind of very quickly after that massive win, all of a sudden there is this turn. It was quite dramatic, the turn that took place. And some people are asking for the impeachment of Nixon because he had cheated to win the election, which he hadn't, but he had done something bad. So the Republican congressmen came to him and they said, Mr. President, you have lost the confidence not just of the country and of the Democrats, but of the Republicans. And we're going to tell you right now, we're not going to necessarily be on your side if they decide to impeach you. So it became very clear to him that if he were impeached, he would be convicted by the Senate and that had never happened before in our country's history. So he decided to do something else that had never happened in the history of our country. He decided to resign. So he resigned from the presidency. It's the only time it's ever happened. He left. Here he is leaving on the helicopter and saying, you know, he wanted to leave with dignity, but he kind of left in really despair. It was not a good thing for him. His vice president was a man named Gerald Ford, who, by the way, had not been elected with Nixon. Nixon's running mate had been a guy named Spiro Agnew, who had his own controversy earlier and had to resign as vice president. Now the president resigns, and his new vice president, Gerald Ford, who had been elected to nothing, becomes the president. Now he was a good guy. He had been an athlete, a football player back in college, and most people liked him for the most part. But he hadn't been elected, so it was kind of strange. The very first thing he did as president was he pardoned the president. So now the president can't be tried for any kind of treason or anything like that because he has a pardon. Some people thought that was bad for Ford to do that. Other people thought it was good. That brings us to 1976, the bicentennial of our country. So 200 years, and it was the birthday. I remember it. I was a kid, and the thing I remember most, we were super excited about a big fireworks show, but it rained and rained and rained, and all the holes that they put the fireworks in were filled with water. We had no fireworks show on July 4th, 1976. Boo. All right, there's an election, and the Republicans have to make a decision. They have the sitting president who had been elected to nothing, Gerald Ford. And Ford was a likable guy, but he was kind of being portrayed as sort of, I think one time, as he was coming down the steps of the airplane, he tripped and fell. And after that, they said he was clumsy, and they had these skits on Saturday Night Live that showed him falling down all the time and this kind of thing. But it wasn't true. He wasn't a clumsy guy. It's just that one time. And so here he is running against a dark horse candidate from the South. This man's name is Jimmy Carter. He was a peanut farmer from Georgia. And there was a huge number of guys running on the Democrat side, but he came out on top. Carter came out on top. And he won it, okay, because he was a very likable guy. He was Southern. Southerners like that. Ford, people really didn't feel like they knew him very well. The whole pardoning thing worked against him somewhat. But I will say that Ford did have somebody who was challenging him for the nomination for the Republican Party, and that was a man named Ronald Reagan. You can see right here somebody else. There was apparently a group right here who voted for Ronald Reagan anyway. I remember at the time my dad was a big fan of Ronald Reagan and was not happy that Ford got the nomination. Voted for him, of course, but wasn't happy about it. You see electorally right here, Carter wins that. So Carter was a genial guy. He was a good Christian man. He taught Sunday school and this kind of thing. And so people trusted him, all right? And so he tried really hard to do some important things. Right here, he's trying to make peace between Israel, this guy's name is Menachem Begin, and Egypt, which is one of the Arab nations, if you will. This guy's name is Anwar Sadat. And they had a big meeting, and the guys are shaking hands. And in a few months, maybe a year or so, this man was assassinated by Muslims who were unhappy with him making a deal with the Jews. All right, so the Middle East was a big problem. All right, this man right here is the king of Jordan. His name is King Hussein. And this man is the head of Iran. We call him the Shah of Iran and his beautiful wife. The Shah of Iran was a king of the country right there. He had been put in that place really after World War II. The people of Iran didn't necessarily feel like that he was for them. He was a brutal leader. He was also a very wealthy guy. He confiscated a lot of wealth for himself, lived very high on the hog, and the people felt like he was not very attentive to them. And so eventually the popular sentiment went against him, and he realized things were getting really hairy, and he decided to leave the country to go on vacation and took a lot of his wealth with him. And he ended up in Europe somewhere, and at that point in Iran, the people decided to mount a revolution while he was gone. And one of the things they did in this revolution was they went to the American embassy, they broke in, that's what you see right here, and they took the people working for America, the Americans working in the embassy, they took them hostage. We call it the Iran hostage crisis. All right, we'll get back to that in just a minute. There would have been a video here, but we don't have time. We're going to look at the art, literature, sports, and music and pop culture. I did keep this in from the 1960s, but 60s and 70s we'll go through pretty quickly. For literature, I hope you get a chance to read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. It is brilliant. It's about life in the South, about some of the racial problems that take place, but it's told so lovely. It's such a lovely storytelling thing. They made a movie about it in 1961, same title, To Kill a Mockingbird. This man, so Harper Lee, he was a good friend of Harper Lee. His name is Truman Capote, another Southern writer, and he was writing at this time. One of his famous pieces is called Breakfast at Tiffany's, also made into a movie. And he also was kind of the beginning of a new genre called true crime. He was fascinated with a crime that had taken place in Kansas, and he went and wrote a story about it called In Cold Blood, also made into a movie. And it kind of developed this new genre of true crime. In other words, it really had happened, and he was telling the story of what really had happened. William Faulkner was another Southern writer. He wrote several long novels about life in the South and how the South had been evolving to what now is going to be called the New South, hopefully. We have a baseball player, Hank Aaron. He broke records as far as home runs go. He, of course, was playing in the big leagues now and made a big impact there. We have a very famous horse that won the Triple Crown. That means all three of the races in the same year, named Secretariat. There is a movie about this one called Secretariat, very good, showing about this beautiful horse. This man, Charles Schulz, was drawing his cartoons. That's Charlie Brown on the right, and the whole group are called the Peanuts. And they were a comic strip, but also made some really lovely little cartoon shows that were very heartwarming, like the Charlie Brown Christmas and things like that. Andy Warhol sort of invented a new genre called pop art or popular art. Here's one of his pieces here. You can see it's a photograph of Marilyn Monroe that he's treated several different ways, kind of tinting it with different tints, kind of like paints on there. Anybody who was anybody got their portrait painted like this by Andy Warhol. This is one of his most famous pieces. I'm not kidding. That's a painting he did, and it's very famous. It's a can of Campbell's soup. There's another one with like 50 different cans of Campbell's soup on there, very popular. He did this one of the Beatles. The Beatles were not an American group, of course, but they got their portrait painted by Andy Warhol. I like this guy a lot. His name is Roy Lichtenstein. He had an interesting style. Okay, kind of a comic book. These things were massive. So picture this, a massive painting, but it looks like we're looking at a comic strip really close up. These little dots that he used in there are called Ben-Day dots, that when you're printing a newspaper, it shows up because it's kind of a cheaper way of printing. He did that for these pieces. Here's a sunset that he's famous for. This is probably his most famous piece. It's called Wham! You can see it's got, words for a comic strip and then action that's going on right there. Music at the time, this is Berry Gordy. You can't see his name very well, sorry about that. Berry Gordy was in Detroit, Michigan. It's called Motown for Motor Town because most of the cars are built there. So he started a company, it's called Hitsville, USA, but it was known as Motown. And he had several really important singers at the time. So we have, this is Diana Ross and the Supremes. That's what he was holding that up earlier. This is Marvin Gaye, I think. This is Stevie Wonder, still making music today. And these guys, y'all, I'm so sorry. I can't remember who these guys are. I don't know. Temptation. I don't know who they are. Sorry. But they were very good. Very good. Janis Joplin was a Texan. She became part of the hippie culture. She was out there in San Francisco making music. She has kind of a real raspy voice. She was with this guy, Jimi Hendrix, who was probably the best guitar player ever. This picture looks backward. I know he was a lefty. Oh, no, that's right. He's a lefty. And both of them were at this famous concert in New York, a field in New York called Woodstock. So this is in 1969, and a bunch of the hippie culture showed up there, more people than had tickets, and it went on for 3 days with lots and lots of bands performing. So all of the bands of the culture, counterculture were there. A lot of anti-war protests going on, things like that. All right, so Jimmy Carter, here he is as president. There was an energy crisis at the time. One of the deals was over in Iran and those other Middle Eastern countries, those are the guys that had the oil, right? And they started not selling oil to us, so our gas prices went really, really high. You can see the picture here of pumps closed, and we had this thing called the energy crisis. And Carter would try to calm people, and he would say to them, well, I know it's cold outside, but instead of turning your heater on, just wear a sweater. People did not find that comforting. Okay, and we slid into what was known as a general malaise. We thought everything was bad. America was past its prime. It was no good. Things were not going to ever be great for America anymore. That's how they felt. The Iran hostage crisis was still going on. Okay, so these people were being kept hostages. Now we're looking at 400 days, y'all. 444 days total. They were hostages there. Then we have an election in 1980. Hostages still there. Okay. Carter's going to run against Reagan. Remember, Reagan had been a consideration for a nominee for the Republican Party back in 76. He is a very optimistic, joyful person, and Carter's like this general malaise, being, oh, well, yeah, things are bad kind of a thing. Reagan comes along and says, hey, remember who we are. This is America, people. We can be great again. America hasn't lost its step. We need to step up and act like Americans. And so he really rallied the people. Look at that map. I was 18 this year. It was my first election ever to vote in, and I very proudly voted for Ronald Reagan. I'm still proud of that vote. You see, he won really big. Look at that electoral vote. Not as big as Nixon's second term, but pretty big right there. So that was a definite, like a rejection of Carter's policies. Nothing he had tried really had worked very well. He was a man with a good heart, but his liberal policies, well, they just tend to not work. So here he is. Here's President Reagan's first inaugural address, and he's standing there, and he made this great speech. If you ever get a chance to listen to any of Reagan's speeches, they are so encouraging, so positive. He was very positive all the time. And right after he got it, I mean, literally, y'all, while he was making this speech, the hostages in Iran were released. And they did that on purpose just to stick it to Jimmy Carter. So they had been hostages for 444 days, and now they've been released. So the very first thing that Ronald Reagan could show as a success for his administration was the release of the hostages. He had negotiated with them, by the way. So here he is, President number 40. Here's a quote of his. You can tell a lot about a fellow's character by his way of eating jelly beans. He was a big fan. Oh, I don't have it. Okay, hold on. There it is. He was a big fan of Jelly Belly jelly beans. I would have brought some of these for you today to have during class time. He loved those Jelly Bellies, and people you could go to the White House, gift shop and buy a little jar like this. Ronald Reagan had been a movie star, okay? So he was mostly in the B movies, meaning not in the top movies. But he was very handsome, likable. He typically played good guys on the screen. Here he was in Newt Rockney All-American. He played the Gipper. And there was this one scene where they said, do it for the Gipper, and so they called, and that was his nickname, the Gipper. I think the guy's name was George Gipp. That was the character's name, and he had been injured or something. I've seen the movie. It's kind of a weepy one. He had been governor of California, very popular governor. At one point, he was a Democrat and had switched over to the Republican Party. I can't remember if he ran as a Democrat or Republican as governor. I'm thinking he was already a Republican by this point in time. So he had an idea about how to bring America out of this malaise, out of this stagnation. They called it stagflation, really. It was an economic term. He said, if we reduce taxes, our jobs and wages will increase. That's known as Reaganomics. He said it's called the trickle-down theory. If we let the people have more money, they will invest that money in new businesses. And they will have more jobs to offer to people. In the end, it really did work. The only problem is the Congress spent a lot of money, so the debt went up really high during this time. All right, during his early in his administration, we had the explosion of Mount St. Helens. Looks like a mountain here. Y'all have been with me in science before. You've seen this, where we had this beautiful volcano. It became active. Remember all those trees and that lake and everything, and then boom, there it goes. It blew its top and sent the dust everywhere, and knocked all those trees down, created petrified wood in a matter of short matter of time. The 1980 Winter Olympics were taking place in America in Lake Placid, and typically when a country sponsors an Olympics, that country ends up winning quite a few medals, and we did that year, especially this one. They call it the Miracle on Ice. It was our hockey team. These are our amateur hockey players playing against USSR, the communists, against their professional guys. And we won the gold medal. It was awesome. They have a movie about this. I think it's just called Miracle. I don't know, but it's very good. Especially if you like hockey or watching sports movies, you might like that one. This happened very early, like in the first 4 months or so of his administration. There was a man standing over here in the crowd somewhere. I don't know if you can see him. That might be him, John Hinckley, who reached out with a gun and actually shot at the president. Now, when that happened, this assassination attempt, this cop I know got shot. This man, James Brady, right here, he got shot. And the president got shot. Here they are rushing him into his car, pushing him in. We thought at first that he was just fine. And then they realized that a bullet had come into his chest. It had hit him, and he had to go into emergency surgery. Now, while he was in emergency surgery, his vice president was acting president at the time. That guy was named George Bush. But Ronald Reagan was so charming as he was recovering in his hospital bed. Here he is looking out the window saying, everything's okay. It's going to be fine. They found out that the young man who had shot him was, nuts. He was crazy. He felt like he was doing something to make a young starlet, a Hollywood star, like him better. Yeah, it was crazy. So he's nuts. All right, the first woman on the Supreme Court was put there by Ronald Reagan. Her name is Sandra Day O'Connor. She was a somewhat moderate ruling justice on the court, but she served for a long time, and well for Reagan. He was always proud of that. All right, Reagan's quote was that we must defeat the evil empire. He actually called it that. People in America who had voted for him were so happy to finally hear somebody not try to appease the communists, but to call them what they were. They were evil. And he said, we've got to bring this Cold War to an end. Okay, there's their sickle and hammer, and things are icy still. And he said the only way for us to win this Cold War is to have peace through strength, not to appease them, not to make friends with them, but to make them afraid of us. He said there's no security in appeasement of evil. We've got to have weapons that they're afraid of. We have to outspend them on weaponry. So lots of weapons were being produced during this time, where Carter had kind of cut back on that. Reagan's going to beef that up, and he came up with this idea. It never really came about, but it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. Some people referred to it kind of in a pejorative sense as Star Wars, because we were talking about having satellite-like structures that would be able to intercept a rocket before it got to America and shoot it out of the sky up from space. It actually was a pretty good idea. It was going to be very, very expensive. Congress wouldn't go along with it, but it's still something that's viable even today to think about. Meanwhile, over in the USSR, they had a reform-minded guy show up. He's not the president, he's not the leader, but he's second in command. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he started instituting new economic programs in his own country called glasnost and perestroika. Those are Russian words, really basically meaning that he was going to free up the society to have a little more freedom for people to choose what they wanted to do with their jobs, for a little bit of entrepreneurship, for other countries to come in and support companies in their country, this kind of thing. It gave just that little bit of that little taste of freedom to the people of Russia, and they demanded more. So it kind of got out of Gorbachev's control at some point, but he ended up becoming the face of the reform that was happening in USSR. And he, in fact, became friends with Reagan. So he and Reagan here are trying to make deals. There was one deal that they went to in Iceland, and when Reagan, they had made, so typically how this happens is that there is all this work that goes in before two leaders meet to have a summit. And some of the decisions have been made already, okay? So they don't go there thinking, I hope he signs this. No, they know what's going to happen. But in this particular case, Reagan shows up, and Gorbachev said, I changed my mind on one of those previously decided deals. And Reagan walked out. He said, nope, that's it. You broke your promise. I'm out of here. He got on a plane and left Iceland. So he was tough that way. So one of the things he wanted to deal with here, you can see, remember we're looking at Germany. This was part of Russia now, USSR right here. And remember Berlin is right there in the middle. This is West Germany, East Germany, and we have West Berlin and East Berlin. There was that huge wall. We know about that, right? Built all the way around there. In 1983, it looked like this, okay, all this time in between. We saw that video about people trying to escape, right? Here it is. You can see the paint on the wall of the western side, right? People on the east were not allowed to paint on their sides. I will watch this video. It's pretty short. It's very famous Reagan right here.
Today I say, as long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So that was a big quote. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We're going to see that's going to happen pretty soon, but not during Reagan's time. The space race continues, and this was the space shuttle program came to being at this point. It had actually been set in motion by Nixon way back, and now it's time for it to take off. There we go. The idea here is that they're going to have a shuttle that can go up to space and come back. All of these tanks were retrievable. We could get them back and use them again. So it was a little bit of a recycle program going on there. And furthermore, we could bring the whole ship back, right? So you think about the Apollo program, all of those parts of the rocket, those little stages, ended up crashing into the ocean and, being ruined, not being used again. So the idea here is they would, lift off, right? They would drop off the fuel tanks here, drop off another fuel tank. When the shuttle gets into space, it's really just like a glider. It doesn't need much fuel up there. And then when they're coming back in for re-entry, it is a big giant glider. They land by gravity, and then they have to have a parachute stopping it right there. Here are the different ones. We had Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. So the 5 different shuttles went up for different missions. Sadly, I'll have to tell you about this one. The Challenger went up, and as this is 1986, Reagan had, by the way, been reelected by this time in pretty much a landslide. He was still quite popular. And he had a dream, and one of his dreams is he wanted to see about making the shuttle program into something that would allow civilians to travel to space. And he said, okay, I think it would be the greatest thing if we had our first civilian in space would be a teacher. And so he set this out to all the teachers of America, and he had everybody apply for it, and there were certain criteria, physical criteria that had to be fulfilled. Anyway, this woman right here won. Her name is Crystal McAuliffe, and she won, and the whole country was so excited about a teacher going up into space. But that day that the space shuttle went up, it was very cold. It was in January. I remember it very clearly. And as it launched, I had the video, but I do. Let's go ahead and watch it.
9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65%. shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
Challenger, go and throttle up.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
So obviously, it crashed. What we decided later, when they did some, investigation, was that there were these O-rings. They'd frozen, and when they warmed up, the O-rings, the fuel slipped past them, if you will, and caused an explosion. So Reagan, of course, I think it was that very day, he came up with a speech to the nation, because everybody was just horrified. This Christopher McAuliffe, I know the other astronauts were on there, but they had devoted their life to being astronauts, and she was a teacher, right? So it was a little different. Her parents were in the audience watching. Her kids, her students, were back at the school watching live on TV. Horrible. And he gave a speech. "We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God." And that's a quote from a fighter pilot who talked about flying up in the sky like touching the face of God. Very sad. Okay, so then what happened was that it was time for another election in 1988, and it was George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president of Reagan, is going to run, because Reagan can't run again. And Bush kind of takes over where Reagan left off. He says he's going to continue Reagan's policies. And he runs against, I have a picture of him here. There he is. You probably recognize him. He spent a lot of time in Texas as an oil man. And so therefore Texans kind of claim him a little bit. He's running against this guy on the right named Michael Dukakis. He's a New England guy up there in the east. Very, very liberal. And George Bush fairly handily won that election, fairly easily right there. So he's president number 41. In fact, some people call him George Bush 41. Because his son became that too. All right, so this is, I'm sorry I've cut his name off right here. There was an incident that took place over in the Middle East, once again, and it was when the president of Iraq invaded another country called Kuwait for their oil reserves. And Kuwait was a sovereign nation, and we decided to go to their defense. And we actually ended up declaring war against them with a coalition of people from an international coalition that George Bush put together. And this is the man he put in charge of it, a 4-star general named Norman Schwarzkopf, known as Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf. And he kept us apprised of all the events of the war every day. He came out and told us what was happening. It was called Desert Storm. It started here as Desert Shield, and then turned into Desert Express and then Desert Storm. And in about 4 weeks or so, the American coalition, so mostly American troops, were able to defeat Saddam Hussein, that's the president of Iraq, and push them completely out. It was an absolute rout, and the victory made George H.W. Bush very popular. At this time, the Berlin Wall actually comes down. Remember, Reagan said, tear down this wall, and then the East Germans and the West Germans worked together to actually pick it down. There is a portion of the wall still standing just as a memorial, almost like a museum, but there was a reunification of Germany. So East and West Berlin joined, and then East and West Germany joined, because we are winning the Cold War. So essentially the Cold War is over about this time. So George Bush was very popular. I mean, literally his popularity numbers were like 96% because of winning that war so quickly, barely any lives lost kind of a thing. And but things went a little sour for him. There was a little trouble with the economy, not bad, but a little trouble with the economy. And he had made a promise when he was running for president that he would not raise taxes. In fact, he had a very famous quote: "Read my lips, no new taxes." But because the economy was going bad and the Democrat Congress sort of pushed through some laws, he signed a law that did increase taxes. And so some of his conservative supporters decided that was too much. They couldn't support him anymore. Along comes this very charming Southern man named Bill Clinton, who was very charismatic. And then there was another problem. This guy right here, his name is H. Ross Perot, decided to run as well as a third-party candidate. So typically when you have that third-party candidate coming in, you're going to see votes taken away from somebody. All right, so H. Ross Perot was a millionaire, a Texas millionaire, and he and George Bush knew each other. They both were working oil fields in Texas, and they were not friendly. They did not like each other. And as some people say that Perot ran just to take votes away from Bush. It's very possible. I don't know. He did appeal to a lot of people. He was a very plain-spoken kind of a guy, and he said, I'll make a difference, and I'll make things good, and this kind of thing. So he ended up ruining it for George Bush. You can see right here, look, he took 18.8% of the vote. That is a lot. Notice he didn't take any states. He doesn't have any electoral votes, but he took a lot of the popular vote away from Bush right here. Now look at Clinton's win, right? 42.9%. Not even 50% of the popular vote. But look at electorally. That's what counts, right? So the next president then, because of H. Ross Perot, in my opinion, Bill Clinton, president number 42. He had a young wife, Hillary, and a young daughter who was living in the White House with him. So kind of exciting, kind of hearkening back to the whole John F. Kennedy era. The only problem is, let me go back to that map real quick. For instance, notice in Texas, the Republican wins there. Remember, Bush was kind of a Texan, right? And notice some of the southern states still went with Bush, right? And part of the problem is because there was a little bit of a question of the character of Bill Clinton. There were stories about how there were these girlfriends and lots of women and things like this. And so he had a little character question. One of the first things he did was to put another woman on the Supreme Court. This is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She's still on the Supreme Court. She's 94 years old, still kicking, still working hard. The court's in session right now, and she's doing that. All right, there was a lot of technology that developed at this time during the Bush era. All right, we have Steve Jobs here with Apple because he invented a personal computer, which you could use yourself in your home, not one of those gigantic things to launch rockets, right? Bill Gates comes along and says, ooh, I can do that too. He comes up with a little different programming thing called Windows, Microsoft Windows, and he allowed lots of different companies to use his technology to make computers based off his technology. Steve Jobs did not allow that. So he had just one computer. They almost failed because the PC, the personal computer that used the Windows program, lots and lots of different computers could use it. For instance, I have a Lenovo. I'm using Microsoft Windows. If you're going to use Mac, you're going to use Apple technology, you have to have a Mac, a Macintosh. A Macintosh, by the way, is a kind of Apple. This guy as well, his name is Michael Dell. I wanted to show you this picture. He took that the Windows operating system and put it into his computer. You can see here there's a tower computer and a big monitor right here with a cord to the mouse and a cord to the keyboard and a cord to the speakers and all that kind of stuff. But his name is Michael Dell. He developed that. He wanted a personal computer, but they were so expensive. And he said, I can build a computer out of stuff that'll be cheaper. And so some of his friends at school said, well, I wanted those. So he started making computers for his friends. And now, of course, he made $1 million off of becoming a computer maker. I wanted to show you this picture because he was in school in his dorm room at the University of Texas at Austin. Okay, so he developed that there. I believe he lives in Austin to this day. Remember I told you Clinton had a couple of character questions about him, and one of those came up when he was actually being questioned about a suit brought against him by a woman who accused him of harassment, of having abused her. And he ended up lying to the grand jury about something about that case. Her name was Paula Jones. And he not only did he lie, that's called perjury. He asked other people to lie for him. That's called suborning perjury. And so impeachment articles were brought against him for perjury and obstruction of justice. and a big trial took place. So remember what happens in impeachment. Remember what happened to Andrew Johnson. So this was only the second time in history that has happened in America. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him, which means he was indicted essentially, and then was going to have to go to court, and court would be in the Senate. When it got to the Senate, they did not convict him, so he was acquitted. This is very similar to what happened to Donald Trump, only the third time in history. He was impeached, but he was acquitted by the Senate. But it did still hurt Clinton that people started to see that indeed he was somewhat of a womanizer. There was another woman who was working for him. She was young. Her name was Monica Lewinsky, and she was brought up into that as well. And he told people that that he didn't really know her, but he lied right in our faces and this kind of stuff. So he lost some popularity even with people who had voted for him previously. I will say he had already won re-election, so it didn't really hurt him because he didn't get put out of office. So he continued and finished his term. In 2000, we're going to have election. We're going to end right here with this, and then I'm going to make you a short video about the rest here. But in 2000, the vice president ran. His name is Al Gore, against George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush's son. He was raised in Texas, so Texans claim him as their own. He had been the governor of Texas for a while, a very likable guy, a very conservative compared to Gore. Gore was a very liberal guy, really a lot of emphasis on the environment and things like that. Okay, so y'all, I'm going to end right here for this week, and then I'm going to make you a short video. If you get a chance to watch it, I would appreciate that, because it's going to talk about what happened in 9/11 and George W. Bush's time in office. Okay, but I'm already past an hour right here. So remember, next week we're going to be doing our project, and we'll get together with Zoom, and I'll see y'all then. Okay, good deal, y'all.